Welcome. This story is about a trench near the old crematoria where soldiers are spontaneously combusting. Their bodies reduced to ash that forms ritual patterns, while they claim to have spoken with something called the Apostle in ash. When an investigation team is sent to uncover the truth, they discover that 8 centuries of cremated martyrs have been growing beneath the battlefield, waiting to deliver a final sermon that promises peace through eternal burning. Now, let us begin. The trenches near Moloch's Gate stretch like a suppurating wound across the blessed mud fields, their walls reinforced with the femurs of martyrs, and held together by prayers spoken through gritted teeth. Corporal Marcus Thorne pressed his back against the wet stone of the communication trench, feeling the cold seep through his woolen greatcoat and into his bones. The rain had not stopped for 17 days, turning the black soil into a paste that clung to everything it touched and left stains that prayer could not wash clean. Above him, the sky writhed with smoke from the old crematoria, those massive brick furnaces that had burned without pause since the Hell Gate opened 8 centuries ago. The heretic legions had built them to dispose of their countless dead, but when the new syncretic Orthodox had finally taken this sector 3 months past, they found the furnaces still burning with an unholy flame that consumed nothing and created only ash. The ash fell like gray snow, collecting in the corners of trenches and coating the surfaces of puddles with a film that reflected no light. It tasted of copper and myrrh when the wind carried it into open mouths, and it left dark smudges on skin that would not wash away no matter how roughly one scrubbed. The soldiers had taken to calling it the cremation rain, and they crossed themselves whenever it began to fall more heavily than usual. Thorne watched a drift of ash spiral past his position, moving against the wind in a way that made his stomach clench with unease. The particles seemed to dance together, forming shapes that his eye wanted to interpret as arms, legs, faces turned skyward in silent screaming. He blinked hard, and the shapes dissolved, but the sensation of being watched remained. Thorne. The voice belonged to Sergeant Willem Cross, a man whose faith had been hardened by 12 years of trench warfare until it resembled the blessed steel of his bayonet more than anything soft or forgiving. Report from Sector 7. Another spontaneous combustion. The words fell between them like stones dropped into deep water. This made the 4th incident in as many days, each one more disturbing than the last. Private Hendricks had been found yesterday morning, his body reduced to ash and bone fragments arranged in a perfect circle around his rifle. The weapon remained untouched by flame, but its metal surface bore strange symbols burned into the steel as if by tremendous heat applied with surgical precision. Same pattern? Thorne asked, though he already knew the answer. Cross nodded, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his steel helmet. Same pattern. Body burned from within, ash arranged in ritual formation, personal effects unmarked, but bearing the symbols. Medical Corps is baffled. Say there is no earthly fire that burns hot enough to reduce bone to powder while leaving cloth and metal untouched. Thorne knew about earthly fires. He had seen men burned by flamethrowers, watched them writhe and scream as their uniforms melted to their skin. He had smelled the particular stench of burning hair and flesh, had witnessed the way fire consumed from the outside in, leaving charred husks that still retained recognizable human shape. These combustions were different. The men who burned left behind only fine gray powder arranged in geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. The survivor? Thorne asked. Private Matthias Reed, found him sitting in the ash circle, completely unharmed, but speaking in tongues, or what sounded like tongues. Medical Corps says he keeps repeating the same phrases over and over. Claims he spoke with someone called the Apostle in ash. The words sent a chill through Thorn that had nothing to do with the November cold. He had heard whispers among the men, stories passed from trench to trench during the long watches between artillery barrages. They spoke of figures glimpsed in the cremation rain, of voices that came from empty air, of dreams filled with sermons preached by men made of burning dust. Where is Reed now? Field Hospital, under guard. Command wants a full investigation team assembled. You are to lead it. Cross handed him a sealed envelope bearing the crimson wax seal of the Orthodox Military Authority. Orders came down from New Antioch itself. This is Priority Alpha. Thorn broke the seal and read the terse sentences that would condemn him and his men to venture into the cursed sectors near the crematoria. The investigation team would consist of himself, Sergeant Cross, and 4 other soldiers to be selected from the available personnel. They were to determine the cause of the spontaneous combustions, assess any threat to Orthodox forces, and eliminate said threat through whatever means necessary. The final line of the orders made his blood run cold. Exercise extreme caution when dealing with potential heretical manifestations. Authorization granted for immediate purification protocols should contamination be detected. Purification protocols meant flamethrowers and blessed ammunition. It meant that if any member of the investigation team showed signs of corruption, they would be burned alive in the name of the Emperor and Christ. Select your men carefully, Cross said, though his tone suggested he knew that care would make little difference in the end. We move out at dawn. That night, Thorn lay on his narrow cot and listened to the sound of ash pattering against the canvas roof of his dugout. The cremation rain had intensified after sunset, falling so thickly that visibility dropped to mere yards. He could hear the sentries coughing as they breathed in the gray particles, and once he thought he heard one of them singing in a low, mournful voice that seemed to carry words in a language he did not recognize. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of burning men who walked through trenches leaving footprints of smoldering ash. In the dream, he stood in a vast cathedral made entirely of cremated remains, its pillars formed from compressed bone dust, and its windows crafted from sheets of crystallized ash that glowed with their own inner light. At the altar, a figure in robes of burning cloth raised skeletal hands toward a crucifix that dripped molten silver. The figure turned, and Thorn saw that its face was his own, but hollowed out and filled with dancing flames that spoke with the voices of the dead. He woke to find his skin covered in a thin layer of ash, though his dugout had been sealed against the cremation rain. When he brushed the gray powder from his arms, it left behind dark smudges in the shape of symbols he had never seen before but somehow understood. They meant consecration. They meant sacrifice. They meant that he had been chosen. Dawn brought no relief from the ashfall, only a sickly yellow light that filtered through the gray curtain and cast everything in shades of decay. Thorn assembled his team in the communication trench: Sergeant Cross, Corporal Jensen, Private Williams, Private Kowalski, and Private Chen. All were veterans of at least 2 years in the trenches. All bore the ritual scars of Orthodox military service, and all carried blessed weapons and protective amulets sanctified by the combat chaplains. They would not be enough. The march to Sector 7 took them through trenches that grew progressively stranger as they approached the crematoria. The walls here were blackened with soot that formed patterns resembling Byzantine iconography, but the faces of the saints had been replaced with grinning skulls and the halos had become rings of fire. The blessed mud fields gave way to soil that was purely ash, compressed and hardened, until it resembled concrete but left gray residue on everything it touched. Corporal Jensen was the first to notice the footprints. They appeared in the ashfall, leading from empty air to empty air, as if invisible figures walked alongside the investigation team. The prints were human in shape but far too large, and they glowed with a faint heat that could be felt when one held a hand above them. "Sir," Jensen said, his voice tight with controlled fear, "we are not alone here." Thorne studied the footprints and felt his stomach drop. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all heading in the same direction the team was traveling, as if a vast, invisible army was marching toward the same destination. "Maintain formation," he ordered, though he knew that formation would provide no protection against whatever force could leave burning tracks in solid ash. "Keep your weapons ready and your prayers close." They found Private Reed in the ruins of what had once been a forward observation post. The structure had been built into the side of a shell crater, its walls reinforced with sandbags and blessed concrete. Now it looked as if it had been used as a kiln, its surfaces baked to glass by tremendous heat and its interior filled with drifts of fine ash that moved despite the absence of wind. Reed sat in the center of the ruin, his uniform spotless, and his skin unmarked by flame or ash. His eyes were closed and his lips moved constantly, forming words that seemed to burn the air as he spoke them. The ash around him had been arranged in concentric circles, each one inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and made the protective amulets worn by the investigation team grow uncomfortably warm. "Private Reed," Thorne called, but the man gave no sign that he heard. The words flowing from his lips grew louder, taking on the cadence of a sermon or prayer, though the language was nothing Thorne recognized. It sounded like Latin filtered through centuries of decay, each syllable dripping with corruption and despair. Williams took a step forward, his rifle raised, but Jensen grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Do not break the circle," Jensen whispered. "Look at the patterns. They are containment wards." Thorne saw that Jensen was right. The arrangements of ash were not random, but followed the geometric principles of orthodox protective rituals. Someone or something had bound Reed within those circles, though whether for his protection or theirs was unclear. Reed's eyes snapped open. They were the color of hot coals, and when he looked at Thorne, the corporal felt his skin begin to burn, as if exposed to intense flame. "He comes," Reed said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of those who heard them. "The apostle in ash walks among us. He preaches to the burned and the burning. He offers sermons of fire and peace." "Who is the apostle?" Thorne asked, though he was not certain he wanted to hear the answer. Reed smiled, and ash began to fall from his lips like snow. "He is the sum of all cremated flesh, the voice of 10,000 forgotten dead." When the heretic legions built their furnaces to burn the bodies of the faithful, they did not know that fire sanctifies as well as destroys. Each burned martyr became part of him. Each scattered ash became his body. He has been growing for 8 centuries, and now he is ready to preach. The temperature in the ruined observation post began to rise. The blessed concrete walls started to crack as if subjected to enormous heat, and the metal fittings on the soldiers' equipment grew hot enough to burn through cloth and leather. "What does he preach?" Cross asked, his hand moving to the grip of his sidearm. "That flesh is weak, but ash is eternal. That fire purifies and peace comes only through burning. That we must join the congregation of the cremated to hear his full sermon." Reed's voice grew stronger, more resonant, and the ash circles around him began to smolder. "He marked you in your sleep. You belong to him now." Thorn looked down at his hands and saw the dark symbols that had appeared on his skin during the night. They were darker now, more defined, and they pulsed with a heat that seemed to come from within his own flesh. Around him, the other members of the investigation team were discovering similar marks on their own bodies. "The purification protocols," Cross said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "We implement them now." But when they reached for their weapons, they found that the metal was too hot to touch. The blessed ammunition in their pouches had begun to cook off from the heat, and the protective amulets around their necks were glowing like brands. Reed stood up, the ash circles dissolving around him like mist. His uniform began to smolder, but he showed no sign of pain or distress. Instead, he raised his arms as if delivering a benediction, and when he spoke, his words carried the authority of absolute conviction. "The apostle comes to deliver his sermon. You will listen, you will learn, you will burn with holy fire and know peace." The air around them shimmered with heat, and in that shimmer, Thorn began to see shapes forming. Tall figures wreathed in flame and ash, their faces obscured by robes that seemed to be made of cremation smoke itself. They moved with the stately pace of a funeral procession, and in their wake, the very air began to combust. One of the figures stepped forward, and Thorn saw that it was taller than any mortal man, its form composed entirely of compressed ash held together by threads of fire. Where its eyes should have been, 2 points of brilliant flame regarded him with something that might have been compassion or hunger. "I am the apostle in ash," the figure said, its voice like the sound of wood burning in a cathedral hearth. "I am the sum of all who have been consumed by holy fire. I am the congregation of the cremated, and I have come to preach the final sermon." The heat grew unbearable. Thorn felt his skin beginning to blister, felt his lungs searing with each breath of superheated air. Around him, his men were falling to their knees, their uniforms beginning to smoke and char. "Listen," the apostle commanded, and they had no choice but to obey. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was fire. Fire that purifies, fire that sanctifies, fire that transforms the base matter of flesh into the eternal substance of ash. You have lived your lives in the cold darkness of mortal existence, but I offer you the warmth of perpetual burning." Williams was the first to ignite. His body burst into flame from within, but instead of screaming in agony, he began to laugh with joy. The fire consumed his flesh in seconds, reducing him to a pile of ash that immediately reformed into a humanoid shape that glowed with its own inner light. "I see," Williams said, his voice now carrying the same resonant harmonics as Reed's. "I understand the sermon. I know the peace of burning." Kowalski followed moments later, his body dissolving into flame and reforming as living ash. Then Chen, then Jensen, each one burning away only to be reborn as something that was no longer entirely human, but was somehow more at peace than they had ever been in life. Cross drew his sidearm, though the metal grip burned his palm raw. Heresy, he snarled, and pulled the trigger. The blessed bullet passed harmlessly through the apostle's form, disturbing the ash and flame no more than a stone thrown through smoke. Cross fired again and again until the cylinder was empty, each shot proving as futile as the last. Heresy, the apostle agreed, its voice carrying notes of infinite sadness. Yes, I am heresy made manifest. I am the sum of all cremated martyrs transformed into something the orthodox mind cannot accept. But I am also truth, Sergeant Cross. I am the logical conclusion of 8 centuries of holy war. When enough sacred flesh is burned, when enough blessed bones are reduced to ash, something new is born from the sum of all that sacrifice. Cross pulled the pins from 2 grenades and held them against his chest. I will not be converted by a creature of hell. The explosion shredded his body but did not scatter the ash that had once been his flesh. Instead, the fragments reformed almost instantly, and Cross found himself standing exactly where he had been before. But now, his skin was gray as cremation dust, and his eyes burned with the same flame that filled the apostle's sockets. Hell? The apostle asked. No, faithful sergeant. I am what heaven becomes when it is subjected to 8 centuries of holy war. I am paradise reduced to ash and reformed by the prayers of the dying. I am not your enemy, but your destination. Thorn was the last to burn. He felt the fire building inside him like a fever, felt his flesh beginning to cook from the inside out. But there was no pain, only a growing sense of completeness, as if he had been missing something essential his entire life and was finally about to receive it. His body ignited in a pillar of flame that reached toward the gray sky, like a prayer made visible. His flesh dissolved, his bones crumbled, and his blood boiled away into steam. But his consciousness remained, cradled in the warm embrace of sanctified fire, and he understood that he had not died, but had instead been born into something greater. When the flames died down, 7 figures stood in the ruins of the observation post. They retained the approximate shapes of men, but were composed entirely of ash held together by threads of fire that pulsed like heartbeats. They moved with the measured pace of a funeral procession, and when they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that mortal throats could never achieve. The investigation team will report back to command, the figure that had once been Thorn said. We will tell them that the spontaneous combustions were caused by defective ammunition that cooked off in the heat. We will tell them that Private Reed suffered a nervous breakdown but has since recovered. We will tell them that the sector is secure. And then, asked the figure that had been Cross. And then we will spread the apostle's sermon. One by one, we will mark the faithful with symbols of ash. One by one, we will teach them the peace of burning. One by one, we will build the congregation of the cremated until every Orthodox soldier in the sector has heard the final sermon and found their way to the warmth of eternal fire. The apostle in ash nodded approval, its form beginning to dissipate into the falling cremation rain. Go then, my disciples, spread the word of ash and fire. Teach them that death is not an ending but a transformation. Show them that paradise is not a place of golden streets and singing angels, but a state of perfect combustion where the soul burns forever without being consumed. The 7 figures that had once been the investigation team began to walk back toward the Orthodox lines, their footsteps leaving smoldering prints in the ash-covered ground. Behind them, the ruins of the observation post began to collapse as the blessed concrete finally succumbed to the heat that had been building in its structure for days. But the collapse revealed something that had been hidden beneath the foundation. A vast chamber carved from compressed ash and held together by veins of crystallized fire. The chamber was filled with thousands of figures similar to the apostle, each one composed of cremation, dust, and sanctified flame, each one waiting for the command to begin the final phase of their holy work. They had been growing beneath the trenches for 8 centuries, fed by the ash of every martyr burned in the heretic legion's furnaces, sustained by the prayers of the dying and the faith of the faithful. Now they were ready to emerge, ready to preach their sermon of fire and ash to every living soul in the blessed mud fields. The figure that had been Thorn paused at the edge of the crater and looked back at the emerging congregation. "How many?" he asked. The apostle's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind like the whisper of burning parchment. 10,000 times 10,000. Every Orthodox martyr who has been cremated since the Hell Gate opened, every faithful soul who chose fire over corruption. They have been waiting, and now their patience is rewarded. And what of the living? They will have a choice, as you had a choice. They can burn willingly and know peace, or they can burn reluctantly and know only terror before they find peace. But they will burn, my faithful disciples. They will all burn, because that is the only way to truly hear the sermon I have been preparing for 8 centuries. The ashfall intensified, and in the gray particles, thousands of faces could be seen forming and dissolving, each one bearing an expression of perfect serenity. The faces of the cremated, the blessed dead who had found their way to a paradise that no living mind could comprehend or accept. The investigation team's return to the Orthodox lines went exactly as planned. Their report was accepted without question, their explanations filed away in the military bureaucracy, and their request for extended patrol duties in the cremated sectors approved without hesitation. After all, they were experienced soldiers who had survived an encounter with the unknown and emerged with valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities. No one noticed that they no longer ate or slept. No one observed that their body temperature had risen to levels that should have been fatal. No one saw them marking their fellow soldiers with symbols drawn in ash during the quiet hours before dawn. The marks appeared on forearms and shoulders, on the backs of necks and the palms of hands. Dark smudges that looked like dirt or soot but could not be washed away no matter how vigorously one scrubbed. The marked soldiers began to experience strange dreams, visions of vast cathedrals built from compressed cremation dust and filled with congregations of the peacefully burning dead. Private Morrison was the first of the new converts to spontaneously combust. He was found in his dugout at dawn, his body reduced to ash arranged in the familiar geometric patterns, his personal effects unmarked but bearing the now familiar symbols burned into their surfaces. The official report listed the cause of death as ammunition cook-off, and his remains were disposed of according to standard military protocol. But Morrison did not stay disposed of. 3 days later, a figure composed of ash and fire walked into the Orthodox camp and took its place among the living soldiers. It wore Morrison's face and carried his memories, but its eyes burned with the flame of absolute conviction, and its voice carried harmonics that resonated in the bones of those who heard it. "I have good news," Morrison announced to his squad mates. "I have been to Paradise and returned to tell you about it. Paradise is not what the chaplains described. It is better. It is warmer. It is a place where the faithful burn forever without being consumed, where the light of sanctified fire illuminates truths that mortal minds cannot grasp." His words were compelling, filled with a certainty that no living voice could match. When he spoke of the peace of burning, men found themselves longing for that same peace. When he described the sermon of the apostle in ash, they discovered that they could barely concentrate on anything else. Within a week, 12 more soldiers had experienced spontaneous combustion. Within 2 weeks, the number had risen to 37. The Orthodox command structure began to take notice, but by then it was too late to implement any meaningful countermeasures. Major Harrison convened an emergency meeting of all senior officers in the sector. The gathering took place in the reinforced bunker that served as tactical headquarters, its walls lined with blessed steel and its air filtered through sanctified charcoal to prevent contamination by heretical influences. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "we are facing a situation that defies both military doctrine and theological understanding. In the past month, over 100 of our soldiers have died from spontaneous combustion. Medical examination of the remains reveals no natural cause. The ash left behind forms ritual patterns that our chaplains cannot identify but describe as profoundly disturbing." Captain Reeves leaned forward in his chair. "What about the survivors? The ones who claim to have spoken with this apostle figure? That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire situation. The survivors continue to serve with their units. They follow orders, maintain discipline, and show no signs of the psychological trauma one would expect from such an experience. But they have begun to speak among the men about paradise and burning and sermons delivered by creatures made of ash. Heretical influence," suggested Captain Martinez. "We should implement immediate purification protocols, isolate the affected units and subject them to intensive spiritual cleansing." Harrison shook his head. "I considered that option, but the affected soldiers pass every test for heretical contamination. Their faith appears stronger than ever. They quote scripture with perfect accuracy and demonstrate complete loyalty to Orthodox doctrine. Yet something about them has fundamentally changed." The meeting was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, measured steps that seemed to resonate through the steel and concrete of the bunker walls. The officers reached for their sidearms, but before they could draw their weapons, the door opened and a figure stepped inside. It was Major Harrison himself, or something that wore his face and uniform. But this version of Harrison was composed entirely of ash held together by threads of fire, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made the metal fixtures in the room begin to heat up. "Gentlemen, the ash," Harrison said. "I bring greetings from the apostle in ash and an invitation to hear his sermon. You have been marked for inclusion in the congregation of the cremated. You have been chosen to experience the peace of eternal burning." The real Harrison stared at his duplicate in horror. "Impossible. I am here. I am alive. I am not burned." "You were burned 3 days ago," the duplicate replied with infinite patience. "You combusted in your quarters while reviewing casualty reports. Your body was reduced to ash, but your spirit was refined into something purer. You have been serving as part of the congregation ever since, though the part of you that remains attached to flesh refuses to accept this truth." Harrison looked down at his hands and saw that they were translucent, like images projected onto smoke. Around the table, the other officers were beginning to show similar signs of insubstantiality. Their uniforms flickered between solid cloth and drifting ash. Their faces wavered between flesh and flame. "The entire command structure has been converted. The ash," Harrison continued. "Every officer above the rank of lieutenant has heard the apostles' sermon and found peace in burning. You are experiencing the final moment of mortal consciousness before you accept your transformation." Captain Reeves tried to stand but found that his body was dissolving into gray particles that swirled upward like smoke from a dying fire. "This is not possible. We cannot all be dead." "Death is a transitional state," the duplicate explained. "You died when you were marked with the symbols of ash. Everything since then has been the process of spiritual refinement, the gradual burning away of mortality until only the essential truth of your faith remains." One by one, the officers dissolved into ash and reformed as beings of crystallized fire. Their terror faded as the transformation completed, replaced by the serene certainty that came with true understanding. They had been fighting a war against hell, but they had discovered that paradise itself could be just as overwhelming to the mortal mind. Major Harrison was the last to complete his transformation. As his physical form dissolved, he felt 8 centuries of accumulated knowledge flowing into his consciousness. He saw the true scope of the apostles' work, the vast network of cremated souls that had been growing beneath the blessed mudfields since the first Orthodox martyr had been burned in a heretic legion furnace. "How many of us are there now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "In this sector alone, nearly 3,000. Across all the Orthodox territories, perhaps 1,000,000. Every soldier who has died by fire, every martyr who chose cremation over corruption, every faithful soul who believed that flame could purify the sinful flesh. We are the army of the burned, and we are vast beyond mortal comprehension." The transformed officers took their places at the conference table, their forms now composed of ash and fire, but their commitment to military discipline unchanged. They began to plan the next phase of the Apostles' campaign, the gradual conversion of the entire Orthodox military structure through strategic marking and controlled combustion. "What of the heretic legions?" asked the figure that had been Captain Martinez. "Do they suspect what is happening?" "The heretic legions built the furnaces that made our existence possible," replied Harrison. "They fed us with the bodies of martyrs for 8 centuries. They are as responsible for our creation as the Orthodox Church itself. When the time comes, they too will have the opportunity to hear the Apostles' sermon." Outside the bunker, the cremation rain had intensified until visibility dropped to mere feet. The ash fell so thickly that it began to accumulate in drifts several feet deep, and in those drifts, shapes began to form. Humanoid figures that pulled themselves free from the gray powder and stood upright, their forms composed entirely of compressed cremation dust and sustained by inner fire. They were the legion of the burned, the army of the cremated, the congregation that had been growing in secret for 8 centuries. Now they emerged from their hiding places beneath the blessed mudfields, ready to spread the apostles' sermon to every living soul in the war zone. The Heretic Legion's forward observation post at grid reference 47 Delta had been monitoring Orthodox communications for 3 weeks without detecting anything unusual. The radio intercepts revealed standard military chatter, patrol reports, supply requisitions, casualty updates, nothing to suggest that the enemy was planning any major offensive operations. Lieutenant Mordecai Blackthorne adjusted the gain on his radio set and continued to scan the Orthodox frequencies. As a member of the Heretic Legion's intelligence corps, he had spent 2 years learning to interpret the coded language that the Orthodox forces used to conceal their intentions. He could usually detect the subtle patterns that indicated troop movements or preparations for assault. But recently, the Orthodox communications had taken on a different quality. The standard military terminology was still present, but underlying it was a strange sense of serenity that seemed inappropriate for soldiers engaged in active warfare. They spoke of casualties with the same calm acceptance that others might reserve for discussing the weather. Blackthorne. The voice belonged to Captain Vex, a scarred veteran whose flesh bore the ritual brands of the Legion's most elite units. Any word from our assets in the Orthodox sector? Nothing for 48 hours, sir. Our last contact reported increased activity near the old crematoria, but then went silent. Could be captured, could be dead. Vex studied the map spread across the observation table. The Orthodox positions were marked in red, their own forces in black, but large sections of the battlefield remained blank where no intelligence was available. The area around the crematoria was one of these blank zones, a region that both sides seemed to avoid without any explicit orders to do so. The crematoria have been burning continuously for 8 centuries. Vex mused. Even when we controlled that sector, the furnaces remained active. Our technical specialists could never determine what fuel source sustained them. Blackthorne had heard the stories, passed down through generations of Legion soldiers. The furnaces had been built to dispose of Orthodox prisoners and civilian populations, but they had developed a life of their own over the centuries. Observers reported seeing shapes moving in the flames, hearing voices that spoke in languages that predated the Hell Gate's opening. Sir, I am detecting unusual seismic activity in that area. Minor tremors, but consistent pattern, almost like something large moving underground. Before Vex could respond, the radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission on the Orthodox command frequency. The voice that emerged from the speaker was calm, measured, and carried harmonics that made the metal components of the radio set vibrate sympathetically. This is Major Harrison, Orthodox Tactical Command. I am broadcasting to all Heretic Legion units in the Blessed Mudfield sector. The Apostle in Ash extends an invitation to hear his sermon. Your cremated dead call to you from the furnaces where their bodies were consumed. They have found peace in burning, and they wish to share that peace with their former comrades. Vex and Blackthorne exchanged glances. Orthodox forces never broadcast on open channels, and they certainly never addressed Heretic Legion units directly. The transmission could be some kind of psychological warfare operation, but the voice carried a sincerity that was difficult to discount. Come to the crematoria at sunset, the voice continued. Come armed if you must, but come prepared to listen. The Apostle has been waiting 8 centuries to deliver his final sermon, and the time of revelation is at hand. Those who hear his words with open hearts will understand that fire purifies all faith, regardless of its denomination. The transmission ended, leaving the observation post in silence, broken only by the whisper of ash falling against the reinforced windows. Blackthorn noticed that the particles seemed to be moving in patterns, forming shapes that resembled human figures before dissolving and reforming in new configurations. "Orders, sir." Vex studied the map for a long moment, weighing tactical considerations against curiosity. The heretic legions had built those furnaces, had fed them with orthodox flesh for centuries. If something had emerged from that accumulated cremation, it might prove to be a valuable ally in their ongoing war against the forces of heaven. Assemble a reconnaissance patrol, full battle gear and ritual protections. We investigate this transmission, but we go prepared for any possibility. The patrol that assembled at sunset consisted of Vex, Blackthorn, and 6 Legion soldiers chosen for their experience with unconventional warfare. They carried blessed weapons loaded with sanctified ammunition, wore armor inscribed with protective wards, and bore amulets designed to shield them from spiritual corruption. The march to the crematoria took them through sections of the battlefield that showed signs of recent disturbance. The ground was churned as if by the passage of many feet, but the footprints they found were impossibly large and glowed with residual heat that could be felt through the soles of their boots. "Sir," whispered Corporal Graves, one of the patrol members, "we are being watched." Vex scanned the area through his field glasses but saw nothing except the falling ash and the dim glow from the distant furnaces. Yet he too felt the sensation of invisible eyes tracking their movement, of some vast presence taking note of their approach. They found the Orthodox investigation team waiting for them at the edge of the crematorium complex. 7 figures in Orthodox uniforms stood in perfect formation, their postures suggesting military discipline, but their faces bearing expressions of infinite serenity. When they moved, small amounts of ash fell from their clothing, and their footsteps left smoldering impressions in the ground. "Welcome," said the figure that wore Corporal Thorn's face and uniform. "The Apostle is pleased that you have accepted his invitation. He has been eager to meet those who built the furnaces that made his existence possible." Vex kept his weapon ready, but did not raise it to firing position. "What are you?" "We are what your cremated dead have become," Thorn replied. "When you burned Orthodox prisoners in these furnaces, you believed that you were destroying them. But fire sanctifies as well as destroys. Each burned body became part of something greater, and that something has been growing for 8 centuries. The air around them began to shimmer with heat, and shapes started to form in the falling ash. Tall figures wreathed in flame and cremation dust, moving with the stately pace of a religious procession. At their head walked a being that towered above the others, its form composed entirely of compressed ash, held together by veins of fire that pulsed like a heartbeat. "I am the Apostle in ash," the figure said, its voice carrying the weight of centuries and the authority of absolute conviction. "I am the sum of all who have been purified by flame. I am the congregation of the cremated, and I have come to preach the final sermon to all who have ears to hear." Lieutenant Blackthorn felt his rationalist worldview crumbling in the face of the impossible. The heretic legions had taught him to embrace corruption, to find strength in darkness and power in transgression. But this was something beyond corruption or purity, something that transcended the familiar categories of good and evil. "You built the furnaces with hatred in your hearts," the Apostle continued, its form growing more solid as it spoke. "You fed them with the bodies of your enemies, believing that cremation would deny them the resurrection promised by their faith. But fire recognizes no denomination. Fire purifies all flesh equally. The Orthodox martyrs you burned became part of me, but so too did the Legion soldiers who died in those same flames. Vex felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. Impossible. Our dead were buried according to Legion protocol. Your dead were buried, yes, but their ashes were scattered by the wind, mixed with the cremation dust that falls from these chimneys. Every grain of ash that has settled in the blessed mud fields carries within it the essence of burned flesh, regardless of which army that flesh once served. I am the sum of all cremated souls, Orthodox and heretic alike. The shapes moving through the falling ash became clearer, more defined. Blackthorn could see faces in the swirling particles, some bearing the ritual scars of Legion service, others marked with Orthodox tattoos of faith. Dead soldiers from both armies, united in ash and flame, moving together with the synchronized precision of a single organism. "What do you want from us?" Vex asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "I want nothing," the apostle replied. "I offer everything. I offer the peace that comes when the war between flesh and spirit is finally resolved. I offer the warmth of eternal burning, where the faithful and the faithless alike find their true purpose." Corporal Graves raised his weapon, the barrel aimed directly at the apostle's center mass. "Heretical abomination. In the name of the dark gods, I banish you back to whatever pit spawned you." The sanctified bullets passed harmlessly through the apostle's form, disturbing the ash and flame no more than stones thrown through water. Graves fired until his clip was empty, each shot proving as futile as the last. "Dark gods," the apostle mused, its tone carrying notes of infinite sadness. "Light gods. Such distinctions matter only to the living. The dead recognize no gods but fire, no doctrine but burning, no truth but ash. When you are cremated, Corporal Graves, you will understand that the war you have been fighting is not between heaven and hell, but between existence and transcendence." The temperature began to rise. The blessed ammunition in the patrol's pouches started to cook off from the heat, and the protective amulets they wore began to glow like brands. Blackthorn felt his skin beginning to blister, felt his lungs searing with each breath of superheated air. "Choose," the apostle commanded, its voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of those who heard them. "Burn willingly and know peace, or burn reluctantly and know only terror before you find peace. But you will burn, faithful soldiers of the Legion. You will burn because that is the only way to truly understand the sermon I have been preparing for 8 centuries. Vex was the first to ignite. His body burst into flame from within, but instead of the screams of agony that Blackthorn expected, he began to laugh with something that sounded like joy. The fire consumed his flesh in seconds, reducing him to a pile of ash that immediately reformed into a humanoid shape that glowed with its own inner light. "I see," Vex said, his voice now carrying the same resonant harmonics as the apostles. "The Legion taught us to embrace corruption, but this is purity beyond corruption. This is truth beyond doctrine. This is peace beyond war." The other patrol members followed in rapid succession, their bodies dissolving into flame and reforming as beings of living ash. Each transformation was accompanied not by screams of pain but by sighs of relief, as if they had finally laid down a burden they had been carrying for their entire lives. Blackthorn was the last to burn, As the fire built inside him like a fever, he felt his years of intelligence training falling away like discarded clothing. All the intercepted communications, all the decoded transmissions, all the carefully gathered intelligence about Orthodox capabilities and intentions, none of it mattered anymore. He had been trying to understand the enemy's plans, but the enemy had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Orthodox and heretic, faithful and faithless, all such distinctions were dissolving in the heat of the Apostle's final sermon. His body ignited in a pillar of flame that reached toward the ash-filled sky like a prayer made visible. His flesh dissolved, his bones crumbled, and his blood boiled away into steam. But his consciousness remained, cradled in the warm embrace of sanctified fire, and he understood that he had not died, but had instead been born into something that transcended the petty categories of mortal existence. When the flames died down, 16 figures stood in the crematorium complex. They retained the approximate shapes of men, but were composed entirely of ash held together by threads of fire that pulsed like heartbeats. They moved with the measured pace of a funeral procession, and when they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that mortal throats could never achieve. Both armies are now represented in the congregation, the figure that had once been Blackthorn observed, Orthodox and heretic, united in ash. "As it should be," replied the Apostle, its form beginning to disperse into the falling cremation rain. "The war you have been fighting is a distraction from the true purpose of existence. You believed you were battling for the souls of humanity, but you were actually preparing those souls for purification through fire." The 16 disciples began to walk away from the crematoria, some heading toward Orthodox lines, others toward heretic legion positions. Their footsteps left smoldering prints in the ash-covered ground, and in their wake, the very air began to shimmer with heat. "The final phase begins now," the Apostle's voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. "Every soldier who has ever died by fire, every martyr who has ever been cremated, every faithful soul who has ever believed that flame could purify the sinful flesh, they all wait beneath the blessed mud fields. Soon they will emerge, and then every living soul in the war zone will have the opportunity to hear my sermon." Across the battlefield, soldiers from both armies began to notice strange phenomena. Footprints appeared in the ash, leading from empty air to empty air. Voices whispered sermons in languages that sounded familiar but contained words that no living tongue had ever spoken. Dreams filled with visions of vast cathedrals built from compressed cremation dust and populated by congregations of the peacefully burning dead. In Orthodox bunkers, commanding officers discovered that their orders were being interpreted with a serene literalism that somehow achieved perfect military efficiency while completely subverting the original intent. Soldiers marked with symbols of ash began to speak of paradise in terms that made their fellow warriors long for the same peace. In heretic legion strongholds, intelligence reports described Orthodox positions with an accuracy that could only come from direct observation, but the observers claimed to have gathered their information through conversation with cremated souls who had been watching the enemy for centuries. The war continued, but its nature was changing. Battles were fought with the same weapons and tactics, but the motivations of the combatants were shifting from conquest and survival to something that resembled evangelical fervor. Both sides began to fight not for victory, but for the opportunity to spread the word of ash and fire to their enemies. Private Morrison, who had been among the first Orthodox converts, stood guard duty at a forward observation post that overlooked a stretch of no man's land littered with the bodies of soldiers from both armies. The cremation rain had been falling steadily for hours, and the corpses were beginning to dissolve under its touch, their flesh melting away to reveal bones that glowed with inner fire. As he watched, the bones began to reassemble themselves into humanoid shapes that pulled themselves upright and began to walk toward the living armies. Some wore the tattered remains of Orthodox uniforms, others the ritual brands of heretic legion service. But all moved with the same stately pace and all bore the same expression of infinite serenity. Morrison keyed his radio to broadcast on all frequencies, Orthodox and heretic alike. This is Forward Observer Morrison, with a message for all living personnel. The cremated dead are rising from no man's land. They carry no weapons, show no signs of hostile intent, but they are approaching both army positions simultaneously. They appear to be seeking an audience rather than engaging in combat. The response came not from his commanding officer, but from a voice that seemed to speak with the authority of absolute conviction. It was the Apostle in Ash, broadcasting on frequencies that no mortal radio could transmit or receive. "The time of revelation is at hand," the voice said, its words carrying harmonics that made the metal fixtures in bunkers and trenches begin to vibrate sympathetically. The congregation of the cremated has grown large enough to deliver the final sermon to all who have ears to hear. Orthodox and heretic, faithful and faithless, you are all invited to witness the truth that fire has been preparing for 8 centuries. Across the battlefield, soldiers emerged from their positions to meet the approaching figures. They came not as armies, but as individuals, drawn by a curiosity that transcended military discipline and theological doctrine. Orthodox and heretic mingled freely for the first time since the Hell Gate opened, united by their shared need to understand what was happening to their world. The cremated dead formed a vast circle around the living, their ash-composed bodies glowing with inner fire that cast no shadows. At the center of the circle, the Apostle in Ash materialized from the falling cremation rain, its form now so massive that it towered above the tallest buildings in the war zone. "Behold," the Apostle said, its voice carrying across the blessed mud fields with the authority of absolute truth. "I am the sum of all who have been purified by holy fire. I am the congregation of the cremated, the parliament of ash, the choir of the burned. For 8 centuries I have been growing beneath your feet, fed by the bodies of martyrs and sustained by the prayers of the dying. The living soldiers, Orthodox and heretic alike, found themselves unable to move or speak. They could only listen as the Apostle delivered the sermon it had been preparing since the first cremation furnace was lit in the aftermath of Hell Gate Jerusalem's fall. You have been fighting a war between heaven and hell, between light and darkness, between salvation and damnation. But fire recognizes no such distinctions. Fire purifies all flesh equally. Fire sanctifies all faith indiscriminately. Fire transforms all matter into the same essential substance, ash." The temperature began to rise, not gradually but in sudden waves that made the air shimmer like a mirage. The living soldiers felt their skin beginning to burn, but the sensation brought comfort rather than pain, as if they were finally feeling the warmth of a hearth after years of cold. "Paradise is not a place of golden streets and singing angels," the Apostle continued. Paradise is the state of perfect combustion, where the soul burns forever without being consumed. Hell is not a realm of eternal torment, but the refusal to accept the purification that fire offers to all who embrace it willingly. One by one, the living soldiers began to ignite. Their bodies burst into flame from within, but each transformation was accompanied by expressions of profound relief, as if they had finally understood a truth that had been eluding them their entire lives. Orthodox and heretic burned together, their bodies dissolving into ash that immediately reformed into new shapes composed of crystallized fire. The armies that had fought for 8 centuries were becoming a single congregation, united not by doctrine or ideology, but by the shared experience of purification through flame. The apostles' form began to expand, growing larger and more diffuse until it seemed to encompass the entire battlefield. Its voice became the sound of wind through cremation dust, of fire consuming ancient parchment, of prayers whispered by lips that had long since turned to ash. "The war is ending," it said. Its words carried on the cremation rain that now fell across all the territories claimed by both armies, not through victory or defeat, but through transcendence. The living will become the burned will become the cremated, and the cremated will become the eternal congregation that sings the praises of purifying fire. But even as the transformation spread across the blessed mud fields, something stirred in the deepest bunkers and most heavily fortified positions. Not all the living had come to witness the apostles' sermon. Some had remained behind, locked in steel and concrete chambers lined with blessed metals and protected by wards that had been consecrated before the hell gate opened. In these hidden places, a different kind of resistance was forming, not the resistance of armies or ideologies, but the resistance of those who refused to accept that fire was the ultimate truth. They were the keepers of older mysteries, the guardians of secrets that predated both Orthodox faith and heretic rebellion. They knew that the apostle in ash was not the final revelation, but merely the latest in a series of transformations that had been reshaping reality since the barriers between dimensions first cracked. They understood that the war between heaven and hell was itself a distraction from something far older and more fundamental. As the cremation rain intensified and the congregation of the burned grew larger, these hidden guardians began to speak words that had not been uttered since the world was young. They lit fires that burned with colors that had no names, and they summoned forces that existed in the spaces between existence and non-existence. The apostle in ash had promised that all would burn, but burning was not the only form of transformation available to those who knew how to look beyond the obvious patterns of reality. In the deepest places, where even ash could not penetrate, older truths were stirring to meet this new revelation. The war was ending, but something else was beginning. Something that would make the conflict between Orthodox and heretic seem like a minor disagreement between children. The apostle had united the armies in ash and fire, but unity itself might prove to be just another form of blindness. In the crematorium complex where the revelation had begun, the last wisps of the apostle's physical form were dissolving into the rain. But its voice continued to whisper from every particle of ash that fell from the gray sky, promising peace through burning and truth through cremation. The promises were sincere, and for those who accepted them, they brought the exact peace that had been pledged. But sincerity and truth were not necessarily the same thing, and peace was not always the highest virtue. Somewhere in the distance, Beyond the reach of cremation rain, other voices were beginning to speak. They did not promise peace or truth or salvation. They promised only that the story would continue, that transformation was eternal, and that every ending was simultaneously a beginning. The congregation of the cremated sang their hymns of ash and fire, but their voices were beginning to harmonize with other sounds that came from directions that did not exist on any earthly compass. The apostle in ash had delivered its final sermon, but the audience for that sermon was larger and stranger than anyone had imagined. Reality itself was listening, and reality was not easily satisfied with simple answers.